Hi friends, welcome to this video where I'll simplify the Union Budget 2022. This will be very helpful for students who are preparing for competitive exams and also for interviews. The budget has been presented amidst the good news that the Indian economy is on a recovery phase. Now if you look at the current financial year 2021-22, our economy is expected to grow at 9.2%. And compare this with last year, where we had a negative growth, understandably, because that year was practically a washout because of COVID, and the growth rate was negative 7.3%. So good to know that we are on a recovery path. And further good news is that next year, 2022-23, our economy is expected to grow at 8 to 8.5% according to government figures. And IMF has pegged our growth rate as 9%, which is much higher as compared to some of the other leading economies in the world. And even when we compare with China, where IMF has put their growth rate as 4.8% in the next financial year. Now, as individuals, we often juggle around with income and expenditure, and in our household we also keep an eye on income and expenditure and try to balance that. And so does companies, for example, where they have a financial statement called the profit and loss account, where they look at income on one side and expenditure on the other side. So similarly, the government also looks at the two sides of the financial performance sheet for a particular year, where they look at income and expenditure. But then, unlike individuals or companies, the government is not earning money. I mean, they're not earning a salary or something like that. I mean, so instead of income, we use the term receipts. So why do we use the term receipts? Because the government is receiving money from various sources, for example, taxes, and the government is hopefully using it or spending it for the welfare of the people of India. So in the budget, which is an annual financial statement, we have two sides. One is receipts and the other is expenditure. Now for most of the countries, almost all the countries, the expenditure, the spending, tends to be more than the receipts. Particularly when we talk about a developing economy like India, where we have to look at welfare programs, we have to look at capital expenditure, then the expenditure tends to be significantly more than the receipts, and the gap between them is then plugged by borrowings. So where does the government borrow from? The government borrows from the people of India, primarily. Okay. Now, how do they do that? Through various sources like saving schemes. For example, if you talk about the post office savings schemes like the NSC or the Kisan Vikas Patra, or if you look at the Public Provident Fund, for example, or look at the Employees Provident Fund, or the various kind of bonds issued by the government or by the RBI. So these are sources for the government for raising money to plug the gap between receipts and expenditure. So the gap is through borrowings, and in very simple terms, borrowings equal to the fiscal deficit. Okay, so fiscal deficit in very simple terms is the extent of borrowings of the government. Now, this year, that is during 2021-22. So when we say 2021-22, it is very simply put as financial year 22, FY22. The fiscal deficit as a percentage of GDP, the fiscal deficit as a percentage of GDP is pegged at 6.9%, which is high. But then understandably high because last year was bad in terms of the kind of receipts that we had, but still, in spite of that, tax collections were still good, and we were able to sort of manage the fiscal deficit to something like 6.9%. And in the next year, Okay, according to the budget, so the budget has been presented for financial year 23, that is 2022-23. The fiscal deficit is pegged at 6.4%. If you look at receipts, receipts are of two kinds: revenue receipts and capital receipts. Revenue receipts are those which are recurring in nature. Capital receipts are those which are non-recurring in nature. So if you look at the money which comes to the government through revenue receipts, primarily, something which happens on a daily basis are collection of taxes, various kinds of taxes, GST for example, or customs duty for example. If you look at capital receipts, which are non-recurring in the sense that it's not something which is of a daily basis, then it can be through disinvestment, for example, it can be through spectrum sales. It is like once in a year receipts of dividends from public sector undertakings and things like that. Similarly, if you look at expenditure, they are also divided into two kinds. One is revenue expenditure and the other is capital expenditure. Again, revenue expenditure are those which are recurring in nature. Capital expenditure are those which are non-recurring in nature. Now, capital expenditure particularly means asset building, because if you're looking at things which are non-recurring, then those are like, let's say, building a dam, building a nuclear power plant, building a new national highway, for example. So those are capital expenditure. Whereas maintaining the road, okay, paying salaries for people who are manning the nuclear power plant are things which happen on a recurring basis, and those are revenue expenditure. So if you now compare the two, that is your revenue receipts and your revenue expenditure, then the gap between the two is either a surplus or a deficit, depending on which side is higher. And typically the revenue expenditure tends to be more than the revenue receipts, which means that the gap between them is called a revenue deficit. So we have now covered fiscal deficit, which is the extent of borrowings of the government of India, and we also now covered revenue deficit. Now let us look at from where government gets money from. Now, one look at the chart will tell you that majority of the amount comes through taxes. Corporation tax, which is the money paid by corporates, companies, by way of tax. Income tax, customs duty, excise duty to the central government of India, primarily through tax on petrol and diesel, GST. Okay, so these together adds up to 30, 35, 42, 58%. So if you look at the receipts of the government of India, a whopping 58% is from taxes. So there's no getting away from taxes, as we can understand. Now, what are the other means of receipts of the government? Now, non-tax revenue, which is 5%, is primarily from dividends, which are from public sector companies and also from public sector banks, and also relatively much smaller collections through entry tickets to national monuments and parks and libraries, or small fines, or sometimes toll collections which go directly to the government, for example. Non-debt capital receipts are 2%, and that is primarily disinvestment proceeds, which means the money which comes from sale of shares of public sector companies. So in this current financial year that is ending in March 2022, the disinvestment target was 1,75,000 crores, but the collection has been something like 12,000 crores as of now. And for next year, the budget is envisaging money to the tune of 65,000 crore coming from disinvestment. So now, as you can see, the government has to resort to borrowings to plug the gap between receipts and expenditure. And how much does it borrow? Something to the tune of 35% of the entire money which comes to the government. So that's huge. Now let us look at how the government spends its money. Now we know that the government is borrowing and for which it is paying interest. So how much interest does it pay? 20%. It's not interest of 20%. It means that out of the money that is spent by the government, 20% goes to payment of interest. Out of the total taxes collected by the central government, primarily through income tax and through union excise duty and customs duty, a part of it, which exactly is 41%. So 41% of the tax collection is shared with the states. So which means that if you look at the total money which is spent by the government, 17% of that. So don't get confused on these two. Like when I said 41%, it means that 41% of the total tax collection of the government is shared with the states. And that constitutes 17% of the total money spent by the government. Okay. Now we come to what is called central sector schemes. Now look at this. This is central sector scheme and this is centrally sponsored scheme. So what is the difference between these two? Central sector schemes are those which are planned, managed and funded solely by the central government. For example, defense expenditure, or let us say expenditure relating to atomic energy and things like that. So, or money spent on public distribution systems, so that's completely funded by the central government and managed by them. Centrally sponsored scheme, on the other hand, are those which are governed by the central government but also managed along with the states. The fund for which is shared between the center and the state. Sometimes it is 50-50, most often it is 60-40, and in some cases it can even go down to 90% by the center and 10% by the states, and that happens particularly when some of these schemes are operated for states in the Northeast. A lot of schemes like the Mahatma Gandhi Rural Employment Guarantee Program or the Prime Minister's Gramin Sadak Yojana, for example, are examples of centrally sponsored schemes. 8% of the money is spent on defense, thanks to our couple of friendly neighbors. 8% is again spent on subsidies. What kind of subsidies? We're talking about food subsidies, primarily through public distribution system. We're talking about fertilizer subsidies to support the farmers, for example, urea, nitrite and all that. We are also talking about petroleum subsidies. Okay. So multiple subsidies, and then pensions for government staff, which constitutes 4%, and then all the other expenses which are not accounted for here constitute another 9%. Now, a particular expenditure which we have not touched upon is this, which is finance commission and other transfers, which is 10%. So what is that? The finance commission oversees the transfer of funds from the central government to the states, the transfer of funds and assistance. So the 41% sharing of taxes which I mentioned has been prescribed by the 15th Finance Commission. Okay? Finance Commission. Now, apart from that, the Finance Commission also supports Gram Panchayats, urban bodies, also supporting the states at time of calamities through sharing of funds for disaster management and things like that. So the finance minister has kept apart 10% of the money for those kind of expenditure, and some of it is contingencies. Now let us look at the provisions of the budget one by one. The first is the Prime Minister Gati Shakti National Master Plan. Now this brings together 7 engines of infrastructure, which is roads, railways, airports, ports, mass transport, waterways and logistics. Now 25,000 kilometers of new national highways will be built during the next financial year. Along with that, 2,000 kilometers of railway tracks will be brought under the automatic train protection system, or which is better known as Kavach. And what is that? That is where it is a protective system where the automatic signaling switches off in case there is an obstruction on the track, so that any kind of derailment or kind of collision or any other accidents can be avoided. 400 new generation Vande Bharat trains will be brought in over the next 3 years. 100 new cargo terminals would also be set up over the next 3 years. And then in hilly areas, there is a new scheme which is called the Parvatmala program, which is a national ropeway development program. And as of now, 8 ropeway projects have been identified, primarily in the northeastern areas where connectivity has been provided through ropeways. Infrastructure. 80,000 new homes will be built under the PM Awas Yojana, and 48,000 crores would be spent on that. Pure drinking water will be made available to 3.8 crore households across the country. All the 1.5 lakh post offices would be brought under the core banking system, and that's excellent news, particularly for investors in post office schemes. The government also proposes a vibrant villages program. So a lot of the villages which are in the border areas have not been developed at all, and particularly because of their geographic location. And this particular scheme has been announced, and it will start off with villages in the border areas in the northern sector, wherein basic infrastructure like good roads and good sanitation facilities, and even to the small extent of having good Doordarshan TV connection, even as basic as that, would be provided to these villages. Productivity enhancement and investment would be brought in through various schemes, the first of which would be e-passports. Now, this is a long-awaited scheme, and this should have been brought in much earlier, because e-passports were in use in India or have been issued in India since 2008 for diplomats, but then it has taken some 12 odd years for it to be issued to citizens. Now, what is the e-passport? On the second page of the passport, there would be an embedded chip which will have all the personal details of the passport holder, the details which are already there on the second page of the passport that we have right now, along with the photograph of the passport holder, the biometric details like fingerprint, for example, and details of the last 30 odd foreign travel undertaken by him. And all these would be available at fingertips through this embedded chip. Now, the beauty of that is that in case there is any kind of tampering with that chip, it will be known immediately, and automatically that passport would be cut off, in the sense that that will become invalid. Now, this will bring about better security for the passports, avoid possibly the duplication of passports, and also allow smooth immigration and travel through various international ports. So hopefully the waiting time would also get reduced because the data is available at fingertips. Now, there is a international ranking of passports which is called the Henley Passport Index, according to which India's passport is currently ranked a lowly 83rd. Hopefully, with this e-passport coming into play, our ranking internationally might go up, and possibly we might see a lot more countries opening up their visa on arrival process for Indian tourists. Let's wait and see. Battery swapping policy for electronic vehicles is again a very welcome step, because this takes care of instant battery charging instead of waiting for the battery charging platform. So how does that happen? You can swap your battery which has been extinguished with which has run out with new battery at designated stations. Now, how this will happen, whether the battery specifications will be the same for all manufacturers, for example, be it Tesla or Tata Motors, or if they have different battery specifications, then it's not going to work out well. So all these things we'll have to wait and see when the policy rolls out next year. One nation, one registration for all land records. That's a very good thing because then it facilitates land mapping and also uh, land survey and all land transaction and documentation on a national basis. 5G spectrum sales would be done this financial year and the 5G mobile services would be rolled out early next year. Optical fiber cabling will be laid across all the villages by 2025. Now, coming to defense procurement, the government wants to give a boost to the Indian industry and particularly to the Make in India project. So 68% of the defense procurement has now been earmarked for domestic industry. So which means that our over-reliance on procurement from abroad can get curtailed, and long term it might even lead to a situation where we will become a strong armaments exporter, but that's a long haul. Now, if you look at capital investment, the outlay for capital expenditure has been increased by 35.4% to 7.5 lakh crores, and that's a very good news. 1 lakh crores will be provided by the central government to the various state governments as an interest-free loan which can be repaid over 50 years. So the focus is on asset building through capital expenditure, which is a very good thing. Now, digital rupee is probably one of the standout promises made in this budget. Now, keep in mind that only 9 nations in the world have their own currency. So India is going to join that list. Now, will it replace cryptocurrencies or will it challenge cryptocurrencies? We'll have to wait and see, because unlike cryptocurrencies, this is something which is brought out by the central bank and managed by the central bank. Now, how this digital rupee is going to be rolled out, we'll have to wait and see, and we await further details from the Reserve Bank of India. But if you go by what has been done in some of the countries which have their own digital currency, possibilities galore. For example, you can transfer rupee with outside the banking channels. So possibly if you have a smartphone, then payment can be done through QR code. For people who don't have smartphones, it can be probably through a SMS link, which gets converted as an e-vouchers. Payment can be done across currencies. For example, rupee can be converted to foreign currencies like the dollar and the euro, for example. It can be used in foreign trade. It can be a big boost to foreign trade. All those kind of possibilities are there. But then, to what extent we will go, and obviously we will take steps very, very carefully, because while possibilities are there, we also understand that it also opens more possibilities of online fraud. So unless and until a very strong system is put in place as safeguards against online frauds, we need to tread this path pretty much carefully. In the education sector, the finance minister has promised the setting up of a digital university. Now, as we all know, in the last 2 years, a lot of shift has happened to online learning because of the tough times, and probably the digital university is now going to sort of unify all these attempts and then bring it under one platform, and then to bring some order into it and to provide quality education at the doorstep of students. The government is also going to have a one class, one TV channel program, which means that for a particular class, let us say, for example, 11th standard, there will be a dedicated TV channel. For 12th standard, there's another TV channel and all that. And then it will also be expanded to cover regional languages. So which means that the education can reach to the lower strata of the society, into the rural areas, people who speak only local languages. So which means that the whole network would be expanded to about 200 TV channels. 1.32 lakh crores is the allocation for the agriculture sector, and out of which 2.37 lakh crores would be spent for procurement of wheat and paddy from farmers for the public distribution program. And so there will be a minimum support price which should be given to the farmers to ensure that they're very sure that they will get a decent price for their toil over the agricultural season. The government also seeks to promote chemical-free natural farming and also the use of Kisan drones to aid farmers by way of land mapping in terms of spraying of pesticides and nutrients, and also for understanding the nature of crops and all that. So this is again a very good attempt. Now, coming to direct taxes, the finance minister has opened up a new window for taxpayers wherein, in case they have an undisclosed income which they want to declare later, then the taxpayer has another 2 years to do so by paying the additional tax. Now, this year there's been no change in the tax slabs, and this is slightly disappointing because this is something which was expected, particularly if you look at the extent of tax savings under ATC, which is right now capped at 1.5 lakhs. There was a hope that would be enhanced. And I think the people of India, particularly the salaried class and the middle class, deserved it, because as we know, in the last 2 years, a lot of people have lost jobs, their incomes have been curtailed and all that. So some small solace for them was expected, but that did not come through. Now, any transfer of digital assets which results in an income will be taxed at the rate of 30%, which means that NFTs and cryptocurrencies or any other such digital assets which result in income will now be taxed at 30%. India has the third largest number of startups in the world after USA and China. We have something around 61,000 recognized startups, out of which a whopping 14,000 new startups have come up in the current financial year. So in order to give a further push to the startup engine, the finance minister has extended this particular scheme for startups, wherein any startup which is incorporated on or before 31st of March 2023 will continue to receive a 3-year tax holiday in terms of 100% tax rebate. Now, for new companies in the manufacturing sector, there's concessional corporate tax rate of 15% plus surcharge, which will be available for all such companies which are incorporated on or before March 2024. So friends, that brings me to the end of this presentation. I hope you liked it. So till we meet again, thank you and bye.